Hey guys, it's vf.miniatures Warhammer Tactics series, and today we'll discuss my top 5 tips for beginner painters. I've been painting for quite a while myself, and I have supervised dozens, if not hundreds, of projects in the vf.miniatures painting studio. So I'll be able to give you both the perspective of a professional full-time miniature painter and someone like myself who learned how to paint from ground up and also wants to save as much time as possible because we want to be playing as much as we can, not sitting at the desk for weeks. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I have not compiled these in any particular order, but to be honest, this advice is probably my favorite one. Airbrush is not a maybe, it's a must-have. If you are looking to be in any way speedy or efficient in your paint jobs, you absolutely need to buy yourself an airbrush. No matter what army you're planning to collect, there will always be 3 things that you need to do with your miniatures: prime them, base coat them, and varnish them. You need absolutely zero skill to do that, and even if you only use airbrush for these 3 things, it will be more than worth the price. You will be saving literally hours, if not days, of painting time just by using the airbrush for that. However, uses for this incredible tool don't stop there, and the more proficient you get with your airbrush, the more techniques and things that you will be able to perform with it. Some extremely simple stuff like just applying a glow effect to the barrel of your gun to make it look like it's hot. That's something that I've done quite extensively in my Tau army. And just that little thing can possibly lift your paint job from the okay level to the level where some people will be raising their eyebrows. Obviously, as with anything in this hobby, airbrushing is a skill and it takes a bit of time to learn, but it's definitely not rocket science and it's pretty fun actually to do. So don't be afraid of that and just buy yourself an airbrush and start. Believe me, you will thank me later. And by the way, it's fairly cheap. You can find an airbrush plus compressor kit for as low as $70. I would not recommend to go as cheap because the cheaper the airbrush gets, the lousier the design gets and the materials, and you will probably be forced to trash this airbrush and buy yourself a new one in like 5 or 6 months of some extensive use. So if you can afford it, I recommend to start at around $100 to $140, $160 maybe to buy something decent. And I'm talking about the airbrush compressor kit with some accessories, so it's not just the airbrush itself. And once you're ready, you can move on to the more expensive stuff like the Iwata clips that I have in the picture here. This airbrush alone will cost you like $180. But trust me, you don't need that level of quality just when you're starting out. It will be a waste of money and you will probably break something on your way. So I recommend to start at something relatively cheap, maybe not the cheapest, and then move on from there. Next important piece of advice that I've learned through the years is metallics and shades are your best friends. Nature and evolution have made our eyes love contrast. We crave it wherever we look. Probably because when there is contrast, we can see that we are actually looking at. And when we know what we are looking at, we can actually decide if that's something dangerous and we should run, or if it's something useful that we can come towards. That's why in all types of art, whenever we can feel, see, hear contrast in some way, shape or form, we like it usually. In miniatures, there are also different types of contrast by luminescence, so how bright or dark something is, by hue, so the color, contrast, shape, texture, and etc. And mixing and matching these types of contrast, it's what makes our miniatures stand out and pop. And as a beginner, what you really want to is create contrast on your miniatures without actually spending weeks of your time behind the painting desk. If you really want to, you can learn something difficult like non-metallic metal techniques, which create contrast manually by hand, creating and drawing basically on the model places where there is a highlight, where there is a shadow, there is a midtone, the reflections, but that takes a lot of time and skill. And if you don't want to spend that much time, your next best choice would be metallics. Metallic paints are great for that because they usually have great coverage, first of all, so it makes it easier for you to apply them, which again saves your time. And the second feature, the main one, is that metallic pigment itself realistically reflects light and provides us with a free sort of highlight, the brightest area of the miniature or a part of a miniature which is painted in metallic, mid-tone and the shadow, so contrast. So it's just the nature of the metallic paint is that even though the classical school of miniature painting requires you to apply a shade above the metallic, and that's something that I would also recommend, and also highlight it. Sometimes you just don't need to do that, especially if the place that you're painting is very, very small. You can just apply the base coat of metallic paint and it will look just fine for that purpose. But of course, if you want to increase the level of your paint job, you should do the shade and the highlight as well. And the shades, on the other hand, help us with the lower end of the luminescence spectrum, and they provide separation where there are a lot of cracks and crevices which would be otherwise very hard to paint in, and create a realistic shadow in there. So paints like non-oil Raycon shade, they are very famous in the painter community just because they are so incredibly useful and they are able to lift something that looks a bit mediocre into the level where it's probably okay to be put on the table. Someone even cleverly named this type of paint a liquid skill. Of course, dipping your whole model into the bucket of paint with a shade like the Army Painter instruction manual recommends may not be the best way to paint a model, because sometimes you don't want a shade somewhere. There are a lot of places where there should not be a shade, and you don't want to tint the color, because that's also something that the shade does. You apply it all over the surface and it sticks to the crevices, but it also tints the entire picture. So if you want to leave the color untainted, you probably don't want to cover the place with the shade, because it will stay there, at least partially. By the way, the contrast paints and the speed paints from the Army Painter lineup, they are all also great for the beginners, because they allow you to save time and paint something like a leather belt on your character or your infantry model better than it would look just if you were to paint it with your base coat and that's it. And it would be a bit hard for you if you are just a beginner to highlight such a little thing, and it's much easier to just take a small fine brush and apply one thing or relatively thin medium coat precisely to this element of the miniature. Basically, these paints, they combine the best of the metallics, because they are creating the shadows and highlights for free without any additional work, and the shades, because they are easy to apply and they deposit themselves in the crevices without any extra work from you, again creating the shade for you. Next advice is wet palette is not just for pros. I've heard this quite a lot from some different beginner painters, which for some reason they believe that wet palette is not useful for someone who's just starting out, and the dry palette will do just fine, and the wet palette is only for the professional painters who need it for some secret dark purpose. Well, I don't know where that comes from, because the wet palette actually just helps you keep your paints usable for hours, even when it's pretty hot in the room. Two best things about it is that it saves you a lot of paint. You don't need to waste paint just adding to the same pile where there is a lot of paint, but it's already dry, so it's not usable, and that's why you need to go back to the pot and add some more paint, add some water, and repeat the process. And the second part is probably even more important, is when you are doing that, you are actually spending a lot of time. So you're wasting not only paint, but you're wasting a lot of time remaking the same paint. And especially when you are mixing paints, you will have to remember how much paint did you take from one pot, from another, from the third, maybe if you're mixing three colors, and try to redo that all over again just because the previous batch of paint has gone bad. It's especially relevant when you got a lot of paint on your palette and you want to make a break, but you know that if you leave it here just sitting like that, it will be dry when you come back and unusable. So you just keep on painting because you don't want to waste the paint. With the wet palette, there is no concern like that. Plus, you constantly need to add water to the paint on a dry palette. You need to do much less of that when you're using a wet palette. Sometimes you want to add water just to dissolve it a little bit because you want it to be thinner, but not because it will be unusable if you don't. When you're a beginner, anything that can make your life a bit easier is extremely important for you, because that's what makes or breaks your hobby journey. If you are constantly battling against your own gear, your own desk, your own lights, everything is just making it harder for you to paint something or to play whatever you're doing in the hobby at the moment. It will probably wear you down and you will grow tired of doing that. So keep your desk, keep your tools very easy to be able to use, and that will make your hobby journey last longer. And by the way, wet pellets are pretty cheap and don't require much maintenance. Of course, you want to sterilize them sometimes because otherwise you may get some mold in there if you are not careful. And that's pretty much it. So keep some paper for them. If you want to, you can buy that from the manufacturer of the wet palette, or you can prepare it yourself. Either way works. And yeah, use it. My next advice, don't skip on the basing. I see it all the time when people are rushing to end the paint job, and obviously you are starting with the model, so you are paying the most attention to the miniature itself, and when the time comes for you to go to the basing part, you are so tired and you want to finish it, and I really know this feeling, but believe me, the basing is what makes and breaks the model. One of the biggest things that actually makes the beginner's model look like the beginner's model is poor basing, both in execution and color compatibility. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in tournaments when I see that a person has invested a lot of time and effort into making the miniature look decent according to the level of skill that they've had, and they've just done a poor job on the base and the whole composition just falls apart. Now, regarding the color compatibility, there's a whole science behind color theory, and I'm not going to go at length about it here because it's a separate topic in and of itself, but in an easy and understandable way, there are colors that are compatible with each other. They are called complementary colors. For example, orange and teal, something that you see a lot in the films and cinema, and same goes for all other colors. There is some color that would work perfectly with other one, and if you don't believe me, just look at the, for example, Blood Angels Codex, the Blood Angels Codex supplement, which its cover is directly following the guidelines of the complementary color theory, because the Blood Angels color is red and the color of the sky in the picture is green, and these two colors are directly in front of each other on the color wheel. Of course, nothing is set in stone, especially in art, and you still can find some good combinations that are outside of this color theory, and don't be discouraged if you really want to make a base and a model of some particular color, and that's just the color that you really like. Maybe just try to make it work in some fashion, mix up the third color, because sometimes two colors that don't work together may work if you add the third one to them. But just use this as a reference, and don't again be discouraged if you really want to try something out. At the end of the day, the most important thing is if you like the miniature or not. If the base tries to be everything at once, it's too flat looking, does not have a crisp edge. Flat looking means doesn't have contrast, basically. Again, we're talking about the contrast here. It doesn't matter how good the model is, the composition as a whole will not look great. If you are into the texture paints, and that's something that usually the beginners start with because it's very, very easy to do, you just slap a bunch of texture paints from Citadel on the base and it's done. Well, actually, it's not done. It's close to being done, but not exactly. And that's where usually the beginners make a mistake. They stop at this point, and you probably should do as follows. You should wait for the paste to dry completely, then add a shade to it, whichever shade you want to use. Maybe add Agric Earth shade, maybe Nano, maybe Rakenfest shade, depending on the color of the paste itself, and then dry brush it. And that's how you create the shade the shadow first of all, and then the highlight with the dry brush. And believe me, it makes a lot of difference. For example, here is a photo of my model before I apply the shade and the dry brush to the texture paints, and after I do that. And as you can see, the results are very different. Also, it helps to acquire some grass tufts because it helps you to sell the realism of the base to the viewer. However, don't overuse them because I've seen the bases totally ruined by the amount of grass that they've had, where they've covered half the model and most of the base. And also pick colors of the grass carefully because you don't want the grass on the model to be brighter than the model itself and to draw too much attention. Buy some modeling stones or go to the beach and collect them, whatever works for you, and also add them because it creates a lot more interesting diversity in your base. And lastly, please keep the edge, the rim of your base crisp, and don't experiment with some crazy colors unless you really are sure that it would work, because usually the black rim is the best one to go for. And when you see the model that has the rim of the base painted poorly, it really takes away from the model, even if otherwise it would look just fine. Lastly, always thin your paints. Another unmistakable indicator that the painter is not that skillful yet is blotchy paint layers. It happens when an overly thick layer of paint is unevenly applied to the surface. Almost all paints work best in multiple thin layers, except for the special paints like contrast paints, speed paints of the army painter, and etc., because those are made to be used in a single thick layer that you just apply to the model, spread it out a little bit, and it's done. You have a lot of layers to work with before the model actually starts losing any details, so don't be very nervous about that. Just keep on trying, and probably after 2 or 3 layers your coverage will be complete. That's, by the way, yet another reason to have an airbrush, because with an airbrush it's extremely hard to overpaint an area and the coats are almost always very even. And to combat blotchy paint layers, you obviously need to learn how to thin your paints, how much you need to thin them, and test the paint before you touch the model with the brush. It's very important. Don't touch the model with a brush that has some paint that you have not tested yet. Just try it on your hand, maybe on a piece of plastic on your desk, something, at least something to understand how thick or thin it is, because if it's too thin it will start running down your model and it can ruin even more of the paint job than just thick paint. With more liquidy paints like the shades and contrast, you should always move paint around after you apply it. Don't be afraid to touch the model, because that's how these paints are designed to work. You can think of them as semi-automatic, so they have a tendency to deposit themselves in the crevices and somewhere where there is an hard edge between two surfaces. But however, you are much better at deciding whether these particular surface needs paint and needs to be tinted or not. That's why you as a painter need to make this decision, not the paint itself. And you have quite a lot of time before the paint starts to dry, and when it actually starts you should put your hands away, because it will make it much worse if you touch it at this point. By the way, with the regular paints it's quite the opposite. Don't touch it at all before it's completely dry. Even if you see that the paint is not enough, this layer is not enough to completely cover this area of the model, cover for example the base coat, just don't touch it, wait for it to dry, because if you touch the semi-wet part of the model it will leave a texture on this area and it will be much harder to cover by the paint, and that's where you start to run into the issues of covering details, because after 4th or 5th layer your paint starts to cover more than just the area that you wanted to, and you will actually be losing some of the resolution. So that's it guys, I hope this video was useful for you. Tell me in the comments if you like this type of videos, the content about painting on the channel. If you do, I'll keep posting it here, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.